welcome to what is either our 8th or our 9th annual Constitution Day event. Professor Coan and I were talking earlier today. We couldn't quite figure out if we did something in 2004. So it's either 8 or 9. But as you might know, the federal government, in the wake of the September 11, 2001 attacks, mandated that state-run schools have some sort of recognition of the Constitution. And it encouraged schools to put on some sort of event or celebration of the Constitution. So that's what we've been trying to do here at Tunxis for the better part of 8 years. And we've had discussions on varied issues like immigration and war. And today we're going to be talking about the U.S. Constitution and the national debt, which has been in the news a lot lately. It seems, though, that the more in the news something is, the less of an understanding that Americans seem to have of it. There's a lot of misinterpretation of what the debt actually is. There are many different kinds of debt. How does it compare to what a deficit is? And because we believe that a lot of people have a limited understanding of the debt, it's a very abstract issue, we decided to make this the topic for today. So there are 3 panelists. Andre Blaszczynski is a professor of economics here at Tunxis. We had to get an economist on board. It just made perfect sense to do so. Professor Coan is a instructor of geography, history, and a number of other things, government too. You've taught a host of items. I am Rafele Fierro. Some of you know me. I have U.S. students, and I teach a course on the U.S. Constitution. And so in some very limited way, we are responsible for educating you all today about what the debt is and what it means for not only contemporary Americans, but the future. So, Professor Coan will be the first to talk. He's going to talk about the historical origins of the debt, starting with the Articles of Confederation. Before there was a U.S. Constitution, there were the Articles. So he'll start with that and offer some commentary on what the Founding Fathers thought. I will speak second and talk about, again, the Founding Fathers and what their views on the debt were. And I will try to connect it all the way up to modern-day America and what some of the repercussions of the national debt are. And then finally, Professor Blaszczynski will talk about the economic aspect of the debt, what it means for us today. He will try to deconstruct some myths that surround the debt and provide a better understanding of what the national debt actually is. So with that said, I turn the mic over to Professor Coan.
Everybody, welcome. Get some food. We paid for it, so help yourselves. Kind of you paid for it, actually. It's sort of a debt issue too, isn't it? The taxpayers paid for it, students particularly. As Dr. Fierro mentioned, I am going to be doing 2 things here, very briefly. Some of you may hate PowerPoint. This is very short. It's very bare bones. It's really just to kind of allow me to keep my train of thought here. 1, I'm going to talk a little about the origins of the American national debt. And then 2, I will be looking at those aspects of the Constitution that pertain to debt, either directly or in a couple of cases indirectly. So it's good to keep in mind, or it's important to know, that the United States of America was born in debt. I mean, literally, from the get-go, this country was in debt. And indeed, the reason the American country came to be was in part because of another debt situation, and that was the British debt. If you know anything about Western Civ or maybe U.S. History 1, these great struggles between the various European powers in the 1600s and 1700s, a number of wars were fought, and the British were involved in several of those. So by the end of that last war, the so-called 7 Years' War, or as it was called here, the French and Indian War, the British Empire had accumulated an enormous national debt, roughly 123 million pounds sterling. I can give you the sources for these figures if you're interested. I just didn't include those on the slide. You have to keep in mind these are estimates too. It's very, very difficult. Professor Blaszczynski could probably explain this better than I, to actually pin down exactly the size of an economy 200 some odd years ago. So these are estimates. But the problem being, the debt actually exceeded the total size of the British economy at that time. So they had a significant debt problem that they had to address. And if you know your US history, who did the British Parliament turn to help address that debt crisis? What part of the empire? The American colonies, of course, which led to ultimately the American Revolution. You can argue there's more to it than that, but that was really the beginning of the crisis between the two. The British need to finance and perhaps pay down their national debt. They turn to the Americans, and the Americans resist that in a whole host of actions that led to the American Revolution. Well, of course, the American Revolution cost a tremendous amount of money. The various states went into debt, most of them, and then the national government ran up an enormous debt also to fight that war. So by the end of the war, when the war ended in 1783, the national debt was about $43 million. What that is in today's dollars, I don't know. But the best way to put that in context is to compare to the size of the American economy at about that period. So in 1790, the estimated GDP for the United States was $187 million. And by 1790, that debt had accumulated to $77 million. So in point of fact, it wasn't as big a debt crisis, arguably, as the British had faced before the American Revolution. But still, something had to be done about this debt. It couldn't just be ignored. The problem being the first system of American national government did not equip the national government to address this debt problem effectively, certainly. What I've pulled out here are the sections of the Articles of Confederation, which again preceded the Constitution, that pertain to debt in some fashion or another. And we don't have to go through all this in any detail. The critical thing is the third paragraph there. Congress was allowed to borrow money or emit bills of credit, essentially that's print paper money, on the credit of the United States. But Congress could not effectively tax. Taxes were really left to the states, and it was assumed that the states would raise the taxes and then make contributions to the national government. So the national government could fund its own affairs. In point of fact, Congress got very little of what it expected from the states. It was only a fraction of what they needed to operate. Congress could also coin money and regulate the value of money coined by the states. And Congress was obligated under the Articles to make good on debt. Look at that last paragraph. So it's really an impossible situation for this new government. It could borrow money, it could coin money, but it could not effectively raise tax revenue. So how on earth could this debt be financed, let alone paid off? Well, to make a long story short, that and a whole set of other crises would lead to a new governmental system, which is still the one we operate under, we hope, at least, the Constitution, which was ratified in 1788. And under the Constitution, the government was given, I suppose, what we could call the full set of tools to finance its affairs in various ways. To lay and collect taxes was specifically given now to the national government. Duties, imposts, excises to pay debts, and to do other things too, obviously, to fund governmental operations, the defense of the country, and so on and so forth. To borrow money on the credit of the United States, and then to coin money, regulate the value thereof, and so forth. So really kind of the three main tools the government uses today. Coining money, or printing it today, borrowing money, and raising taxes. Under the Constitution, the national government has all three of those powers. And this is Article 1, Section 8. These are powers given to the legislative branch. And these are enumerated powers. They're clearly stated in the Constitution. There are some other references to debt in the Constitutions, mostly explicit, some not. This one actually caught my eye, Article 1, Section 10. So again, this is still the powers given to the legislature. These are actually prohibitions on state governments under the Constitution. No state shall coin money. That should be emit bills of credit. I think that's a typo. So I was interested in emit bills of credit. I actually did a little research. What does that mean? And what it meant to the framers of the Constitution was print paper money. It didn't necessarily mean that states couldn't borrow money, but they could not print paper money. That was their paramount concern. They wanted to prohibit that. And so that's in the Constitution. Article 6, the first part of that, is really a reiteration of what's in the Articles of Confederation, that all debts, contracted engagements entered into before the Constitution, i.e. under the Articles, are valid against the United States under the Constitution. In other words, the U.S. government would assume all those debts and pay them off, would make good on them. And we should point out Article 5, which lays out the amendment process. As you should know, the Constitution can be amended. It's a very difficult process. It's only been done 27 times in over 200 years. But in theory, Congress and the states collectively could do what in terms of debt? In theory, they could do anything they want. They could walk away from it. They could propose and pass the so-called balanced budget amendment. You might have heard that kicked around from time to time. So in theory, debt could be addressed through Article 5 if there was a strong enough desire to do so. But it's very difficult to do in reality. The last direct reference to debt in the Constitution is not in the original document. It's actually in one of the amendments to the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, which was passed in 1866, which was 1 year after what ended, if you know your history? I think I heard it. The Civil War, the U.S. Civil War. So this section states two things. One, any debts of the U.S. government would be made good. So any debt run up as a result of fighting the Civil War, the U.S. government would make good on. But any debt that was in the service of the Confederate government would not be made good on, and in fact could not be legally collected. So this amendment in particular repudiated the Confederate war debt. That didn't have to be paid. Nobody would have any legal claim. I think that's it, actually. So the Constitution does not have many references to debt, but several of those I showed you are obviously extremely important. And probably the most important are in Article 1, Section 8, the power to borrow money, to coin money, to tax. That's explicitly given to the U.S. government under the Constitution. I'll turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Fierro, who will continue the conversation. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to continue where Dr. Coan left off by first looking at some of the words that the Founding Fathers actually said about public debt and national debt, and try to get the spirit of what they were talking about, and eventually was put into the U.S. Constitution. Now, overall, the Founding Fathers were of the opinion that the U.S. government had every right to carry a debt. But what's interesting about what the Founding Fathers also thought is that they had a responsibility to pay off the debt. And typically, the point of demarcation was within a generation. And so it was very important to them to not leave debts hanging in the air so that it would be passed on to other generations. I think Professor Blaszczynski will talk a little bit more about that in terms of what that means for the modern day. But if we look at some of the actual Founding Fathers, that spirit of paying off the debt as an obligation is very apparent. James Madison, who's oftentimes called the father of the U.S. Constitution, described national debts as moral obligations. Not just constitutional ones, but moral ones. And I think that's an important distinction. George Washington, of course, had a few things to say about the debt, and here are his words: "No pecuniary consideration is more urgent than the regular redemption and discharge of the public debt. And none can delay be more injurious or an economy of the time more valuable. So pay it off as quickly as possible," is what George Washington is saying. Alexander Hamilton agreed. He said states like individuals, so there's no real distinction in Hamilton's eyes between what individuals have to pay off in debt and what states, in other words, governments, pay off. No states, or states who observe their engagements are respected and trusted, while the reverse is the fate of those who pursue an opposite direction. And so for Hamilton, it was a matter of national importance to pay off the debt, because internationally speaking, the United States would not be the respected nation that it would become if it didn't pay off its debt. And Hamilton also spoke of, although at times he believed the debt was favorable to the United States, he spoke of extinguishing it within 30 years. That is roughly a generation. Jefferson, for once, agreed with Hamilton when he wrote, "No generation can contract debts greater than may be paid in the course of its own existence." So once again, he's talking about that intergenerational phenomenon of paying off the debt before the next generation inherits it. Okay. There's another man by the name of Robert Morris. He was the superintendent of finance for the new American government. And he said upon leaving office in 1784, before the constitutional deliberations took place, "The payment of debts may well be expensive, but it is infinitely more expensive to withhold the payment." He called debt a positive good, the inestimable jewel of public credit, he referred to it as. So I think, again, Professor Blaszczynski will talk about why it's okay to have a debt, but once again, the spirit of the founders is to pay it off as quickly as possible, and at least within a generation. Now, Professor Coan talked about the text of the Constitution, and he rightfully pointed out the many places in which it explains about the debt and how there is this obligation to pay it off. And so, overall, the founders believed, the framers of the Constitution believed, that the Constitution itself clearly gives the government the right to have a debt, but the responsibility to pay it off is all important. 2 generations later, Abraham Lincoln agreed with that assessment. He was a student of the founders, I would say. He thought the debt was okay to have as well. In fact, he encouraged it. In 1864, he told Congress, quote, "The great advantage of citizens being creditors as well as debtors with relation to the public debt is obvious. Men can readily perceive that they cannot be much oppressed by a debt which they owe to themselves." And that's really the meaning of a public debt, and I know that Professor Blaszczynski will flesh that out a bit more. Now, of course, Lincoln was talking about the debt to finance the Civil War. So really, debt, if you define it another way, is a way to finance a country's obligations, whether it be war or social programs or what have you. So among the founders, as with leaders of the future, it was okay to have a debt, but financial obligations had to be made and had to be met. What about the national debt today? What is all this talk of the $16 trillion and ticking? You've seen the ticker every second. It's moving way up rapidly. There seems to be a sense of urgency associated with it. Is that sense of urgency justified? Well, conversations about the debt today become more frequent, especially amidst hard economic times. When things are not going well economically, that's when questions of the national debt seem to emerge more than when things are going well. And that is generally because as spending increases, politicians tend to spend money. As it increases and the economy doesn't do well, then less revenue is brought in. This is something that Professor Coan indicated. And if less revenue comes in because the economy doesn't do well, then the government gets into a crunch. And that's the problem. That's why you see the debt skyrocketing. There are other more complex reasons, but that's the simplified version of it. Now, there was a famed economist who died a few years ago by the name of Milton Friedman. He believed, and I think rightly, that the key to reducing debt is to stimulate the economy and to reduce spending. Although you don't want to reduce spending too drastically, too quickly, because that could have a very deleterious effect on the economy. Some statistics, by the way, the federal government from 1962 to 1997 ran deficits, which are related to the debt, but are not the same thing. A deficit is the gap between how much money the government has and how much it has to spend on an annual basis. And so, if how much it spends is more than what it has, then the debt, the overall debt, goes up. And from 1962 to 1997, the government ran deficits. That is, it spent more than it had, with the exception of 1969. Now that changed in 1998, when the government began to run surpluses. So it had more money than it actually spent. That's not to say that the debt was addressed because of the surplus. The debt was largely ignored. One of the reasons the debt was largely ignored is because the 1990s were a very prosperous time for the United States. So talk of debt was minimal. In that year, 1998, the surplus was totaled at $69 billion. It rose to $214 billion the following year. And the year after that, it went up even more. The reason for the surplus was not laws that were put into place that created surpluses, but because of the economic boom of the 90s associated with the information revolution that spurred economic development. So the economic boom of the 90s created economic growth, which in turn created surpluses. So when the surpluses were created, they were created because of the economic boom, which in turn put more money into people's pockets, which in effect broadened the tax base. So without passing a single law, taxes were increased. Sometimes politicians don't have to do anything to increase the tax base. In fact, sometimes the more they do, the worse it gets. Okay. So to me, the extent to which the national debt is a problem today, and I think it's quickly becoming a problem, the solution must be twofold. It has to be an economic one and a political one. You have to spur economic development, or at least from the federal government's perspective, to create the conditions which can spur economic development. And you have to restrain spending in a sober-minded, steady, but slow way. Here's the problem, and I think this is the reason why we have $16 trillion in debt, projected to be near $20 million, I think, in 4 years, 20 trillion. There's a golden rule of politics that gets in the way of curbing the debt. And here's the golden rule. When politicians have money, they spend it. That's never not been the case, as far as I can tell. There should be an addendum to that rule as well. When they do not have money, they spend it. And there's an even added addendum to that, addendum 3. When they have money, and the money is yours, they tend to spend it even more rapidly. And finally, when Americans have less money for politicians to spend, politicians will contrive new ways to get it from you so that they can spend it. Okay. So here's the thing. How do we restrain that spending and spur economic growth at the same time? Well, I think, as is always the case in American democracy, ultimately it is up to people to put the pressure on political leaders to stop spending from becoming too exorbitant. Now, some have proposed a balanced budget amendment. It's difficult to pass an amendment to the U.S. Constitution if that is indeed the answer. It's difficult because it requires support from both houses of Congress, the signature of the president, and 3/4 of the states to approve of an amendment. Those are high hurdles, and those are hurdles that can only be overcome with Americans becoming educated and knowledgeable and putting pressure on politicians to do something about this. Okay, thank you.
Hi. What I'm going to be talking about is just the national debt. I did not go into, well, also solutions nor the issue of the deficit, though perhaps we can address those in questions. So what I set out to do is just give you a lot of information. Okay, first of all, the statistics. All right, now this first slide here, you've got the GDP up top. That's the I think that was second quarter of this year. Okay, so that's the most recent number. It's $15.5 trillion. And the total debt outstanding as of September 20 was 16 trillion. So you see that just in those terms, the debt is 103% of GDP. But there are other things that have to be considered. For one thing, a lot of this debt is actually owed to other parts of the government. So the government owes itself money, and that amount here is about 30%. That's the third line here, okay? Intergovernmental holdings, okay? Now that's a money that the Treasury had borrowed from, for instance, the Social Security Trust Fund and things like that, okay? So a lot of people say, well, that shouldn't count because the government owes the money to itself. Then if you subtract that, you get something that's defined as debt held by the public. That's the 11 trillion here. That's about 72% of total GDP. Then there is another part here. The Federal Reserve actually owns a lot of government debt. And that number has actually risen considerably in the last few years. It used to be about 700 billion before the last maybe 3 years. But since we've had QE1, QE2, and now we're having QE3, that basically is the Federal Reserve Bank, which is the central bank of the United States, an agency independent from the Treasury, buying U.S. government bonds, in other words, lending money directly to the U.S. government, and that's about 1.7 trillion at this point. That's as of June. So that's 11% of the debt. And then if you take that away, subtract from it, or if you add the money that's owed to the government and owed to the Federal Reserve, that's about 6.5 trillion, and then subtract that from total debt, you see 9.5, or in other words, 61% of GDP. Point is that different people are going to tell you about how big the national debt is. Some people will talk about 100% of GDP, that's the top number. Some people will talk about 72% of GDP, that's net of what the government owes to itself. And some will actually talk about 60%, which is also netting out the Federal Reserve. Question is, which of these things actually makes sense to look at, and we'll talk about that in a second. I just want to give you a few more interesting statistics. The amount of the national debt that's held by foreigners, in other words, money we owe to foreigners, that's over $5 trillion now. It used to be a lot smaller. It's been growing very, very rapidly. It's now about 1/3 of the total national debt and 1/3 of the value of total stuff produced by the economy, that's the GDP. Now if you take that away, and net of government and Federal Reserve and foreign, that leaves about 4.3 or 4.4 trillion, or 28% of the total debt. That's basically debt that is held by, U.S. institutions and so on, and individuals. And then just a few more things. Much of that debt is actually owed to various kinds of banks, pension funds, and you have these numbers here, which leaves, in terms of debt that's actually owed to individuals, not institutions, that's about 1.7 trillion. That just gives you some idea of who do we owe the money to. Now, I did a few very simple projections in, 4 years ahead. And these are projections based on a growth in GDP of 2.5%, which is on the optimistic side given where we are. But it's not, it's more or less the average rate of growth we've had in the past, whatever, half a century. And if you look at GDP, it should grow from what is now almost 16 trillion to about, I'm sorry, about 15 point something trillion to about 17 trillion in 2016. Now the debt, that projection, I just took a simple $1 trillion deficit every year. And that's pretty much what the current Obama budgets are projecting. Okay, so I just look at, I just simplified it. It's about, you know, the calculation is easier instead of adding a different number every year. It's about $1 trillion. So you look at it, it is slated to go up to 20 trillion by the year 2016. The other thing is that what's important here is another number is the debt service, or specifically the interest payments. Okay, in 2011, last year, on $15 trillion of debt, we paid about $453 billion in interest. But realize this was at a very low interest rate. The interest rate, the average interest rate at that time was 2.9%. The thing is that that kind of interest we really can't expect to continue. If you take a look at, just for a minute, for a comparison, in 2001, the interest rate, average interest rate was 6.5%. And if you take the same amount of debt that we had in 2011 and had to pay that interest rate, it would be $1 trillion we would be paying in interest. Now, to give you an idea of what that means in terms of the total national budget, the total national budget is about $4 trillion, so 1/4 of the budget would be paid just in interest, and that's assuming only the amount of debt that we had in 2011. Of course, if you extend it out to the 20 trillion we will have in 2016, we're looking at way over 1 trillion and a big chunk of the budget. So that's just to give you some idea about the statistics. Now, what is the national debt? A lot of people are confused about that. We already had the distinction made between the deficit, which is the annual amount of money that the government falls short of and then adds to the debt. It is the obligations purely of the United States Treasury. It does not include, for instance, unfunded liabilities for Social Security payments, Medicare, Medicaid, and veterans. I mean, the federal government programs, called entitlement programs, have obligations way into the future. Now, if we had to do accounting the same way that a private corporation does, we would probably have to include the present value of those obligations as part of the debt, but that stuff is not included. Of course, on the other side, of course, we should also be counting the expected tax revenues and take that. But there's still a huge deficit there in terms of how much we are obliged to pay under various entitlement programs versus how much money we expect to get. So that will be a huge part that will be added to the debt, but we don't include that. We don't include federal employee unfunded pension and retiree health plans, which is another huge amount. We don't include, of course, the Federal Reserve Bank liabilities. We only include the part that the Federal Reserve specifically borrowed to the Treasury. But the Federal Reserve itself has a lot of liabilities. In fact, they go into trillions. That is not included, certainly, in the national debt. Of course, the nice thing about the Federal Reserve is they can borrow as much as they want without a limit. So they can always, well, that's another story. It does not include state and local government debt, which, as we know, is also a huge problem in the United States. Now, back in the colonial days, the federal government, took over the debts of the states. I don't think the federal government would be capable of doing anything like that this time around because it's probably has difficulty paying its own bills. And it, of course, doesn't include any corporate or private individual debt. The other thing is that a lot of people, I mean, you hear this, that the political rhetoric gets, really thick and heavy out there around election time. But a lot of people say, well, it's the biggest debt it's ever been, and they talk about the actual absolute numbers. Well, you really should talk about it, not in absolute terms, not in terms of how many trillions there are, but rather what the debt is relative to the GDP. Because that's the key number. That's what explains, that's what indicates whether the debt is sustainable or not, whether it's too large, too small, or just right, or not significant. And if you look at that, the debt has, today's debt, it is large enough or larger than, I guess the last time it was this large was during the Korean War. And it was bigger still under, at the end of World War II. But that's pretty big. But once again, we should talk about the debt in relative terms, relative to the GDP. Now, one of the questions that I sort of brought up, and let's talk about it some more. Depending on, I mean, what is if different people talk about the national debt in different ways. Depending on who you ask, they'll give you a different number. So once again, is it 100%, which is the total national debt, or is it 70%, the portion that's quote-unquote held by the public, or 60%, which also excludes the amount we owe to the Federal Reserve, okay? The question is, which one should we look at? Well, depends again on which politician you ask. They'll tell you a different number, okay? But let's ask ourselves, okay, should we, for instance, exclude the amount that's owed to other parts of the government? For instance, the amount that we owe to the Social Security Trust Fund. Well, that's kind of the same thing as if we would decide in our personal life to borrow money from the money we put aside to pay our mortgage. I mean, is that something that shouldn't be counted? I suggest to you it should be counted, okay? Simply because these are still obligations that we have to pay. I mean, in fact, if you look at the things like the Social Security Trust Fund, it used to be that they had too much money coming in than there was paying out. In other words, there were the amount of money that taxes money that was coming in on payroll taxes, Social Security taxes, was larger than what we were paying out the retirees at the time. Well, that's changed. Now, for the foreseeable effect, for as far as we could see, the Social Security Trust Fund is going to be paying out more to the current retirees than is being paid in terms of taxes. And by the way, the payroll tax cut was actually made that worse. Not the best idea that came around. But anyway, although it is bipartisan, both the Obama and McCain proposed, in fact, it was originally his idea. Anyway, but the thing is that right now the story is that those funds have a deficit. Significant deficit is going to be growing and growing. So that means that the rest of the government has to have a surplus. So in other words, again, these are real obligations. We should not discount that in any way. And also the amount we owe to the Federal Reserve. Well, right now the Federal Reserve is trying to expand the amount of money in circulation because it's trying to grow the economy. It's not succeeding a whole lot in that regard. The original QE1 actually was very successful. The following programs, well, not so much. But the point is that the Federal Reserve now has a whole lot of government bonds. But as soon as the economy starts taking off, guess what? The Federal Reserve is going to have to mop up a whole lot of those reserves, and the way it's going to do that is by selling the government bonds it has. So should we not include that as part of our debt? Well, we should, because realize the Federal Reserve doesn't really want to own these things, then we'll have to sell them at some point. In which case, don't discount that either. In other words, to me, the right number is the 100%. Okay. Otherwise, we're kind of fooling ourselves. By the way, the Federal Reserve, talking about myths. Okay. One of the things that a lot of people said is, well, there's an easy way to get out of this debt. Okay. All you have to do is have the Federal Reserve print a lot of money. In effect. In other words, why not have, because the Federal Reserve can write unlimited checks against itself, okay? That is the beauty of the Fed. Why not have the Federal Reserve just buy the whole debt? Which means, in essence, print a whole lot of money and lend to the government, and we can write off the whole thing. Problem with that, of course, is that it would cause huge inflation, okay? And the inflation, by the way, actually is another way of taxing people. I mean, if you think about it, the government can either take your money directly by asking you to pay it, or it can inflate the currency, and that means all the prices of everything you buy goes up, and whatever income you have, guess what, buys less. It's a tax. Your real income, your purchasing power goes down. So ultimately, that's not a very good solution, because if you're talking about retiring this huge debt or any significant portion of it, it would cause not only inflation, it would cause hyperinflation, ultimately destroying the currency altogether, and of course with it the economy, and produce, guess what, the Great Depression. There's two ways to get into a Great Depression. Both of them involve destroying the money. One is by destroying it, by making it disappear. The other one is by inflating. Same result. So that's not something that's a viable option. Now, the other thing is that a lot of people get all excited about this debt, and actually, as long as the debt isn't ridiculously high, then we don't really have to worry about it too much, okay, because we do owe it to ourselves. By the way, Japan's debt is even higher than ours. It's 200% of GDP, but almost all of it is internally held. And so that is, for Japan, more or less sustainable, although they've got some other issues, which I think they're going to crash into a wall anyway. But, the point is that if you owe all the debt to yourself, then you can have a fairly significant amount. 200% is, I think, way out there. Nevertheless, it's not as much of a problem as it would be if we owe it to foreigners. By contrast, Greece's debt is almost, well, mostly external, and of course, you've seen what's happening with Greece. Ours is 33%, which I would say is approaching a dangerous level. 25% is still okay. 33% is too much. And it's growing, that's the other thing, although it may not. At some point, I think the Chinese are going to stop lending to us. Now, the other thing is, oh yes, a lot of people say, well, that's okay because the United States is in a very special position in the whole world. I mean, we have a very privileged position in global finance for two reasons. One is everybody uses the US dollar as a reserve currency. So that means every central bank around the world, they hold US dollars. So basically, we can go ahead and print a lot of dollars and borrow a lot of money, and people are going to be happy to lend us because they want our currency. And this is the biggest economy, so everybody looks at our economy and it's the most stable, it's the most secure in many ways, and so people are very happy to lend us, okay? But you got to be a little careful about this. I mean, right now this is a very fortunate period because, for instance, Europe is going, the whole crisis. I mean, they're going to hell in a handbasket. It doesn't look too good, and so we benefit because all the Europeans want to put their money in something safe. And guess what? We're still safer. But that's like like I said, the prettiest horse in the glue factory. In fact, yeah, compared to the Europeans, we're still a good bet. I know President Obama said this too. Yeah, this is still the best bet. Well, that's nice, except one of these days the Europeans are going to get their act together, and at that point, we're no longer going to be the prettiest horse in the glue factory. The other thing is that so far, in the past 10 years at least, or 15 years, the Chinese have been very happy to lend us the money because they used us as a way of financing their economic transition. They brought 300 million workers from the ineffective or inefficient economy into the modern economy, and they've done it by basically giving us credit so we buy their products and keep the thing going. And that's nice. It was very convenient for us, but remember, that's about to end. So there are two reasons for us to really take in other words, don't be too confident about the fact that we've been very lucky so far and been able to borrow huge amounts of money at very low interest. That's not going to continue. The European situation is going to change, and so will the Chinese, even more so. When that changes, we may be in serious trouble. Another kind of issue, which is I could call it a myth, is that people say, "Oh, we're mortgaging our children's future." Well, that's not entirely true. At least it wouldn't be true again if the debt was reasonable, because the thing is, let's talk about Peter and Paul. We're borrowing from Peter to pay Paul today. So that's not an intergenerational transfer, that's intragenerational. Peter and Paul are living today. So we're taking from one guy, giving the money to another one today. Now, when we're trying to pay off the debt, what are we going to do? We're going to tax Paul's children and pay Peter's children. Again, that'll be intragenerational, not intergenerational transfer. So, this business about mortgaging our children's future is a little bit of an exaggeration, but only a little bit, and I'll get into that in a second, okay? It does have distributional impact, and not the kind that we like, and particularly not the kind that Democrats like, because ultimately, who lends money to the government? People who are relatively well off. Who's going to get the interest payments? Well, again, people that are relatively well off. Who's going to pay the taxes? Well, people who are slightly less well off. Granted, half the population doesn't pay any income taxes. Nevertheless, it'll be the lower or the middle class paying the higher class. So in terms of income redistribution, generally it's not a good thing to have a lot of debt and a lot of interest payments. So borrowing, to borrow from richer Peter to give poor Paul today may be okay, it may help inequality or reduce inequality, but when we have to pay it back, it's going to go the other way. Okay. Now, when is the national debt a real problem? Okay, and I've identified 5 areas. Okay, one is debt service and national budget. Okay, debt service is, rolling over the debt and interest payments. Am I running over time?
No.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I wanted to make this short. Okay. Debt service is basically the interest payments, although it usually includes more. But the point is that when it's large enough, as I told you, in 2020 we're probably going to have 1.3 trillion or more just in interest payments. Okay, and that's not even counting some other things, just rolling over the debt. Okay, the problem is at that point, that makes it difficult for us to spend money on other things. In other words, the federal budget becomes uncontrollable. We wind up with this huge interest payment, and then what if you got a national emergency, a war or something else? Guess what? You got no money to pay for it. It becomes extremely difficult. In fact, it's going to begin to, it is already, it's on a track record, it's on a trajectory. It's on a trajectory to begin having an impact in terms of the government's ability to do the things that we all want it to do. And when that happens, that's a problem. And at that point, it will become an intergenerational transfer because it'll be the poor that will suffer. And it'll be future generations that will suffer because of the inability of the government at that point to offer the services that we expect from the government. So when it gets to be large enough, when those interest payments get to be large enough, it's a problem, okay, for the national budget and for the services that we expect government to give us. Another thing is crowding out. To the extent when the debt gets large enough, and we have to just roll it over, okay, which means the government's constantly in the markets, the credit markets, borrowing more money. That's going to, if it gets large enough, that increases the interest rate. And right now it's very low because of the Europeans, because of the Chinese, but that will end, okay? That interest rate will start rising, okay? And when the government has a huge debt and huge deficit, the borrowing it does raises interest rates. And when interest rates go up, guess what? Investment spending goes down. And that has a huge impact on the economic growth. In other words, again, in this sense, we are mortgaging our children's future because the economic growth that's not going to happen is going to take away from their income, isn't it? So that is a huge impact going forward. Finally, or the third, perhaps the most important thing, is that at some point, if the debt gets large enough, as a percentage of GDP, somebody's going to ask the question, hey, is the US government really creditworthy? In other words, are we not going to have the US government start skimping on paying some of these things, or coming up with, in fact, inflating the currency, or doing things of that sort that basically destroys this debt? When that happens, and you can never tell when it will, there is no solid rule here. We know that 100% is dangerous for most countries. For the United States, difficult to say. We probably can go quite a bit further, but the question is how far, and you never know when that might happen. But when it does, when the credit worthiness, I mean, we've had a downgrade of our debt already, but that didn't make much of a difference because, again, the Europeans did even worse. But at some point, that can happen. Okay? And if you think it can't happen to the United States, you're wrong. It can happen to every country. And when it does, when in fact the credit markets, the investors and creditors begin to doubt our ability to pay, or our willingness to pay, then the consequences are absolutely horrendous. Take a look at Greece, and I think that's what we're looking at. Again, when it will happen, at what level of debt, I don't know. In fact, nobody knows. But it's, I think, would be prudent for us to be concerned about it. Two more problems. One is, it is a drag on the economy when it's large. One of the things that happens is that when people take a look at the debt, just ordinary people and business people, they say, well, at some point taxes are probably going to have to go up. Okay, and the other thing is, if not that, then the Federal Reserve is going to have to inflate the currency, right? I mean, when the debt gets large enough, people start expecting higher taxes and they start expecting inflation. And those expectations, of course, also raise the interest, and they tend to dampen consumer and investor confidence. So it is a drag on the economy. In fact, I think one of the reasons why this economy, this recovery that we're having now is so limp is that people are in fact concerned about future taxes and inflation. And that debt, you know, when we look at it, it's not so much the debt we have now, but the fact that it's projected to keep on growing at a very high clip. That's really giving people second thoughts, and they're wondering, hey, what's the world going to look like, you know, 2 or 4 years down the road, and am I not going to have to be paying a lot more taxes, and you know, is my purchasing power going to be gone? So that is a problem, okay? And of course, to the extent interest rates are higher, again, that also causes something else. You know, interest rates are going to go up. What do you think is going to happen to the debt situation of the states and municipalities? They're already in crisis. That might get worse. In fact, it definitely would get worse. So that's something else that's sort of out there that's hanging over us. So, and we're at a point where, in fact, we really ought to focus on this. Finally, this large debt would render Keynesian policy ineffective. Now, one of the things that you hear a lot, you know, this Keynesian policy being discussed, the Republicans are going to tell you, oh, the fact that the Obama, what's it called, the stimulus bill didn't work, that to a lot of them is evidence that Keynesian policy is dead. Keynesian policy is the idea of revving up the economy by increasing spending, lowering taxes, or monetary expansion. Well, as an economist, I think I need to tell you that that's not really the case. I don't think Keynesian policy is dead. The real problem is that the stimulus bill that was passed was not a Keynesian policy bill. It was basically a pork barrel bill. The idea of Keynesian policy is that you want to take money, shift money from people who in fact are mostly savers and give it to people who are going to be spending it. You also want to basically want to increase spending. But the problem is that the way this thing was structured wasn't going to do that. Okay, so and then there's a lot of stuff that we talk about, but basically was just poorly designed. But the national debt being large enough actually makes Keynesian policy ineffective. Okay, both fiscal and monetary policy. If the debt payments, the interest payments get large enough, guess what? That takes away so much freedom to maneuver in the federal budget. So if you want to have, you know, expansionary fiscal policy, guess what? You can't afford it anymore when you've got such a huge amount of interest to pay. So basically, if that debt gets large enough and those interest payments get large enough, fiscal policy becomes unavailable. It happened in the 80s, by the way. For much of the 80s, when we needed some fiscal stimulus, guess what? All we were focused on is trying to get the debt down. Well, the same situation we have now. So fiscal policy becomes unavailable. And the other thing is monetary policy also becomes ineffective, because to the extent you have if people begin to, particularly if there's this question of creditworthiness, if people begin to worry about the security of the debt of the country, and you have all the banks have all these bonds, then of course you get a banking crisis. When you get a banking crisis or a financial crisis, guess what? The banks are loath to lend to anybody. So as a result, the Federal Reserve can go ahead and expand all the reserves they will. It will have no impact. In fact, that is also the situation we're in now, isn't it? The Fed is expanding the money, not having much of a bang for the dollar. So the point is that a huge debt also, in fact, makes it more difficult for the economy to get out of recessions. Enough said. I think I've taken way too much time, so questions?
I'd be happy to take your questions or comments. We have about 20 minutes left, so I'm hoping that we can get the audience involved. Questions or comments about the debt for any one of the three of us?
Okay. I just wanted to know, in the Keynesian policy, is this an offshoot, or is trickle-down economics sort of an offshoot of that? Or, I know you're laughing, which is what I'd like to do too about it, but I'm going to ask the question anyway.
Well, Actually, now trickle-down economics is a term that Democrats apply to the economic policies of Ronald Reagan. Okay? The thing is that you really ought to get away from the political stuff. Okay, the Republicans are dumping on Keynesian policy, and the Democrats are dumping on supply-side policy. Actually, they're both wrong. Both policies work. Okay, and they work just different ways. So, for instance, let me give you an example. Okay, Ronald Reagan cut taxes. Okay, and of course, from his point of view, from Arthur Laffer, who was the chief economist, well, that was going to have a lot of supply-side effects. It was going to create incentives for people to work more, to invest more, and that's true. But it was also Keynesian policy because it threw out a lot and basically gave a lot of people a lot of money. And in fact, if you look at the effects, the Keynesian effect was much bigger than the supply-side effect. But the point is, okay, if you listen to the discussion between Democrats and Republicans, the Republican is going to point to the supply-side effects, and the Democrats are going to point to the Keynesian effects, and because of the politics, they're going to deny the effectiveness of the other. They're both wrong.
Other comments, questions? Can't have any cookies until you ask a question.
I know that after World War II, we had a really massive debt as well. What approach should we take after World War II to get out of the debt, and should we mirror that policy today?
I guess it's for Professor Blaszczynski.
Well, actually, after World War II, for a period until 1951, one of the things that happened is the Federal Reserve was in fact funding a lot of this. Okay, and of course, until the Fed actually, there was an agreement between the Treasury and the Fed in '51 said, okay, no more. So yeah, in an emergency, you could do that. Okay, but you can't do it for too long. So ultimately, we started balancing our budget. Okay, and running surpluses and paying off some of the debt. Okay, but primarily the effect was, I mean, the most important thing was the economy grew, but we didn't expand. I mean, if you look at the years of, I guess it would be Eisenhower, but budgets were balanced pretty much throughout the 8 years of his administration. Now, that may not be the best economic policy in general, but that is one of the things that, one of the ways we did lower that debt. Anybody else? Questions?
Fran has it.
Oh, just
I'm
to
sorry, go
follow
ahead.
up, I mean, if you keep in mind, the United States emerged from that war in a really unusual economic position, in that most of its major economic competitors had been destroyed to a large extent, or crippled because of the war. So we really did have an advantage for probably a few decades over most of the rest of the world. Other questions? Comments?
How would the end of the war affect the budget deficit?
The end of World War II?
No. How we're overseas? Yeah.
War in Afghanistan?
Yeah.
So how would the end of the, I guess broadly speaking, maybe the war on terror, but particularly the war in Afghanistan, affect the budget deficit? Deficit or the debt?
Well, I think Professor Blaszczynski may know more about this, but relative to the GDP, the wars that have been happening over the last 10 years have not consumed as much of the federal budget as the entitlement programs that have been in place. I could be slightly mistaken, but he would know better. And so if that logic is true, I don't know that we would come out of those wars in a better economic position than when we were in them.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, the wars that we fought recently were not all that expensive. Okay? So I don't think it's a huge impact. Although there is there's a whole matter about that in terms of the current political debate. In that, when President Obama claims that he has cut the budget by $4 trillion, Then part of that is in fact the wars that we're not going to be fighting, okay, and it's about, I think, $1 trillion. Except the problem is that that money that we were spending on the wars, that trillion over 10 years, by the way, the money that we, and that's an exaggeration, but anyway, the money that we're spending on the wars, actually, that's already been reallocated to other things. So when he says he's cutting the spending, national spending, or the budget by $1 trillion, that's basically cutting money that he never intended to spend in the first place. Bit of a bogus thing.
Could we tax the corporations or the entertainment industry to get more money?
I suppose we could.
I think we ought to tax everybody in Hollywood.
That will be more than the total number, the amount of money spent in Iraq and Afghanistan. Right? Get that much from them. That would be a kind of anti-supply side philosophy of taxing corporations. So does that work?
I think quite the contrary, we should move in the opposite direction. The thing is, I mean, we actually have the highest tax rate on corporations right now in the world. And that means that a lot of corporations that are sort of multinational, well, they're going to be moving to other countries, in which case we're going to tax them nothing. Remember that 100% tax of zero income raises how much money? Zero. The other thing is, I mean, in fact, what we got to do is cut the corporate tax down to zero, and tax individuals if you want to, or tax consumption or something else. But that's the last thing we want to do, because economically it'll cause more harm than good. So.
In the back.
How do you think outsourcing has affected economic growth and economic debt? And in addition, how do you think our tariffs have affected it? Because we used to have much higher tariffs, I believe. I may be incorrect on that, and I don't know how that has affected our economic situation.
I feel like we should defer to the economist every time. Ask me about the founding fathers.
The Constitution.
The Constitution.
The thing is that, I mean, as an economist, I have to tell you that all trade, all economic exchange is good. So, including outsourcing. When you outsource a job, when a company does that, basically what that does is reduces the production cost of some good. And that means that the price of the good is going to be lower to all consumers, and all consumers' wealth, income increases because their purchasing power increases. And that also means they get to save a lot of money. The question is, what do they do with that money? Well, they spend it on other things, creating jobs in other industries. Also, when we pay for people who, jobs, the people who are now working abroad, right, foreigners, guess what? They get to have some American dollars. What are they going to do with those dollars? Ultimately, those dollars come back here demanding our products. So basically, the effect of outsourcing, as well as the effect of trade, as well as the effect, by the way, of immigration, is to improve productivity, to increase productivity in both countries. In all countries, of course, productivity increases. Wages, incomes go up, jobs go up, good for the economy, all the way around.
Just before I get to your question or comment, from a historical point of view, I know in 1930, the U.S. Congress passed the Hawley-Smoot tariff, which raised tariff rates by 1/3, and that, some scholars at least believe, contributed to the severity and the longevity of the Great Depression. And so I think Professor Blaszczynski is right. What you want to do is promote as much free trade as you can. And I do think that sometimes outsourcing gets a bad rap. I know the temptation is that it takes away American jobs, but I think that tends to be overblown. And in fact, there are a lot of jobs that are insourced, as many as that there are outsourced, and you don't hear much about that. So we ought to be cautious about these terms that oftentimes get politicized.
I know you guys said it's a lot of high hurdles to attack to get the amendment, But with the way that politicians are today and the way the American people are informed, do you think we would ever be able to get another amendment and that would help the debt overall?
Or the balanced budget amendment?
Yeah, I think he's referring to a balanced budget amendment. Yeah, I think that's one possibility, but I also am tempted to say that what you really need to do is change the political culture. An amendment is an amendment, and I mentioned in my presentation it could help. But I think we have to get Americans to be a little bit more restrained in what they want to spend money on. You know, as I said, much of the federal budget is consumed by social programs. Now, it's easy for me to say we should cut this or cut that and reduce spending, but what we're really talking about is various constituencies. These are people who, when you know, their own dollars coming in from the federal government get cut, that's a problem. So it requires a rethinking of how we look at our own wealth and our own situation in order to do something about it. So it goes deeper for me than a balanced budget.
Yeah, two comments. I'm going to trip yet. I think it's impossible to get such an amendment passed, quite frankly. The hurdles are so high, I just don't see how it would be possible. It'd be politicized immediately, and you know, it doesn't take that much to stop an amendment from being passed. And two, an amendment, a balanced budget amendment, would have to be written in such a way that would give the federal government flexibility in time of an emergency. And I think that would be a sufficient loophole for Congress to find ways around actually balancing the budget. So I don't know how effective that would be.
Actually, I oppose the balanced budget amendment. But the question is, you know, when does it make sense to balance the budget, and what does that mean? Okay, now Eisenhower, indeed, his whole economic policy told his folks that just balance the budget. I mean, totally balance the budget. There's zero deficit, zero surplus. That's not a very good economic policy, because if you get into a recession, guess what? The budget goes automatically into deficit. And if you want to balance, then what do? Cut spending, increase taxes, which makes the recession worse. That's what we call pro-cyclical. You don't want that. You can talk about, say, balancing the budget over the business cycle so that you have deficits in a recession and surpluses in expansion, except for one problem. Business cycle really is not cyclical. In other words, it's not really a cycle. It's just, you know, the economy grows and once in a while you have a recession. So, you know, balancing over the business cycle doesn't make much sense either. Then ultimately there's something called functional finance, which says, hey, if you have a recession and you want to be propping up the economy, you should run deficits. And the rest of the time you want to either balance the budget or have a surplus, but that's basically what we have. The only problem is, in other words, we don't need a balanced budget for that. Okay, so a balanced budget amendment. So I don't think that's the thing that is going to solve much of a problem. And I can't see how you can write this to make it work. In other words, so I know that's a favorite thing for people to say, particularly Republicans. But they're, you know, whistling Dixie here. You know, it's just not possible. What I suggest as an amendment is that as a requirement for you know, qualifying as a voter, you should take an economics course. That would make sense.
I would support that.
Anyone else before we break for the day? Okay, before you go, I just want to, is there another?
No more questions?
No more questions. So you're all educated now on the national debt. Before you go, I just want to thank a few people, MIT and Mike Zich, for videotaping and providing the technical support. Let's see, we have the social sciences department, which paid for the cookies, which were still in great abundance of. That's extremely important. And the panelists for having done this. It takes some time to put together a presentation, and I think we're all the better for it, so thank you. And to you for coming. I appreciate it. Thank you.